Hey, welcome back to another live stream here on the channel. Nick here, talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. A little bit later tonight, I know, 7:30 Melbourne time. Unfortunately, did get caught up a little bit at work and the traffic coming home wasn't as friendly as what I thought. Did as best we could. 7:33, we're kicking things off, so it was a tight finish there. A little bit annoying too because I had some really early appointments today, testing in the lab. 6 a.m. start right through until about midday, and then nothing in between. So I went out, took a bit of me time, went out, did a bit of bike riding, got a bit of a cycling session in, some easy zone 2, and then had to go back to work just for one more appointment this afternoon, which meant we couldn't start bang on our 7 o'clock usual. So apologies to anyone who might be watching on the replay and you're not able to join us because we have started a little bit later tonight. Again, that's the way it is. I'll put in, and as I'm going through all these live streams in the future, what I'm actually going to be doing is putting in the time codes. You might have seen from last week's live stream, I had the time codes done, so you can actually scroll across the bottom of the YouTube video when you see it as a replay, and instead of watching the entire block, you can skip to the sections that make the most sense to you, or the questions that you think, or it'll be down in the description afterwards, after I've gone through and coded everything. You'll be able to see exactly what questions were answered in the live stream. I think it's a better, more interactive way of you clicking through. I'll shorten it up and put where part 1, part 2 is in case I need to skip through a bit. Or there's a part where, like last week, we had some tech issues of me trying to get the graph up, or me just trying to find where the graph I was referencing was in my notes and things like that. So it's the type of thing I'll put those little skips in, so you can just go across that little scrolly bar at the bottom of the screen, that real red bar with the circle you can drag towards later in the video. You just go across and you can click on the individual spots and it'll come up with a little title as to what that component is, or what that question, that discussion point was from the live stream. So without any further ado, we'll kick off tonight. I do have a great question that came through from one of our active sort of members in the community here, Alan, who sent it through via Instagram. Want to kick things off with his first question in a moment, but as always, make sure we do get some people coming into the live stream, joining us on the channel, whether it is via one of these live stream Q&As or whether it is some of the videos. A couple of great videos that we did have go up over the last couple of days, and hopefully you've had a chance to go and watch those. If not, go check them out before the end of the week, or go check them out after the live stream. Definitely worth looking into. A couple of interesting topics around how I determine volume for a particular athlete, and then a few questions around the respiratory system, lung elasticity, respiratory trainers, and then swimming, and that's its impact on things like carbon dioxide tolerance, being able to then do a little bit more in terms of our efficiency of breathing and our breathing mechanics, rather than just simply looking at is our lung capacity set? Are there some adaptations we can still achieve through the respiratory system? So as we get into some of the questions in a moment, make sure, as always, check out the little subscribe button down below. If you aren't subscribed to the channel and you are watching on the replay or you're joining us live, please click that subscribe button. Join us up on the channel. Always great to continue to grow this great community we've got here. And as Alan has done, which I'm going to get to his question in a second, go check us out on Instagram as well, at @NJ_sportscience. Best place to be able to have a look and see exactly where I am in terms of being able to get in contact with me. Send me a direct message, being able to then pass your question through if you can't make it on the live stream, or just ask a question generally. Also, some different content on the Instagram page as well. Some little bits and pieces, some shorter form content rather than the bigger videos we have here on the channel. You can go check out over on Instagram as well. So definitely go recommend that out. All the information down below in the description, but like I said, at @NJ_sportscience if you do want to go check that one out. We'll get stuck into our first question. I've just seen a question pop up about VO2 max in the chat, and I will get to that in a moment, but I wanted to get to this one first because it was sent through on Instagram. So Alan, thanks for sending this one through. Great to have your questions and discussion points as always. Well done on the marathon the other week as well. Had a bit of a discussion with you about it, so good to see you got through it. In terms of our first question for tonight, and apologies for reading off my phone, but it is a bit of a long one. Alan sends through Q&A for tonight. After a marathon, I took a week off running. Just walked 1 hour for day 1, 2, and 3. Rode my bike day 4, 5, and 6, 20 minutes each day to and from work. Day 7 after the marathon was my first 10K easy run. And then week 2, he's back to his 6 days a week running. So normal routine from that point onwards. In his case, his weekly mileage was about 65 kilometers a week. He's intending to go 35, 45, 55, 65, then back to 55 for a rest week. He's asking, is that too aggressive of a build back after recovering from one of his key events, or his A event, or A race, if you like? And I think it's a pretty interesting question because everyone sort of recovers differently depending on how their body reacts to the stress that is the event. First and foremost, you want to give yourself enough time to recover. And I think what you've done there, Alan, is you've gone days 1, 2, and 3. We've just gone for a walk. I think is a good option. Make sure that the body is feeling okay. Make sure there's no long-term damage or there's any niggles or injuries hanging around as a result of you pushing yourself in the marathon. Getting into some cycling is a good way to keep up some of that aerobic stimulus. So you're maintaining through this week. It is a bit of rest and recovery, repair, but maintaining some of that aerobic work by doing some cycling, unloading the legs, also great option. And then I think as you move back in, you'll probably find it's pretty easy to start to get back to that normal weekly mileage relatively quickly because, let's face it, you've done all the work leading up to the marathon. You've then tapered, raced, had a bit of recovery, and you're good to go. I would be quite progressive, like you've sort of done there, where you've gone maybe starting back, instead of jumping straight up to 65Ks straight away, maybe start at something like, you might start at 35 or 40Ks. 10Ks a week adding on, as long as it's distributed across the whole week, probably isn't too bad. If we're talking across 6 different runs, or 6 different days you're running in that week, I don't think 10Ks across that time, we're sort of talking the better part of 1 to 2 kilometers each run, not even. I think that's a pretty reasonable amount to be adding on, or maybe in your long run you add 2 to 3Ks and your high intensity you don't add anything that week. I think that's pretty reasonable. So quite quickly you can get back to that 65 and then it's just a case of building back. So I don't think it's too aggressive. If you were going straight back into, as I said, 65Ks straight away, so race week, recovery week, back up, and then we're back up at 65K straight away, you might find that you just don't, that spike in acute load is just a bit too much, and that's where you break down a little. But I think how you've done it, where you're intending to go 35, 45, 55, 65, a little bit more progressive. Maybe you could even go 35, 45, 55, deload, then go to 55, 65, maybe 75 if you want to push a little bit further. That might be another way to look at it if you want to be a little bit more cautious about it and have another rest week in there somewhere just to make sure you're back on top of things. But I don't think what you're doing is too aggressive by any means. So hopefully that answers that one there. Interesting question though, post-event, getting back into the training for our next one or getting back into training in general, how do you actually transition back from getting a bit of recovery in, which is obviously critical and important, to being able to go back up to our weekly mileage? Definitely an interesting sort of topic there. So I really appreciate you sending that one through on Instagram. Haven't had a chance to reply to it because I did see it while I was at work, as I mentioned before. Finished a little bit late, hence why we had a little bit of a later start tonight. But as of next week, we'll be back at 7 p.m. Onwards as best we can. If there is an interruption, I'll try and get out a message, whether it's on Instagram or whether it's on the community page. If you haven't checked out the community board on the channel, if you head over to my channel just by clicking my name down below and where my little photo is, you'll be taken straight to my channel. You'll see a couple of titles across the top. One of them says community, and that's where I post on here just to be able to make some updates, whether it is some polls about some different things in terms of what you want to see on the channel, some updates of some videos coming up, but then also things like when I'm going live, I'll typically post on there as well, particularly if something goes a little bit different to what we had, in particular tonight where we had to start a bit late as well. So keep up to date with that. Instagram's always the place where I'll let you know exactly when we're going live, and always put a countdown timer as well, so you'll be able to see how long have we got to go if I am running a little bit late or maybe even going a little bit early. Really does depend on the working schedule now. Is a bit more difficult to work around now that I'm back at work. It's a good thing, but out of lockdown, it does mean I've got a few other things I have to get to before we get to our live stream. So apologies for the late start, but great to see Alan sending his question through on Instagram, because if you can't, if for whatever reason you can't make it, send it through on Instagram. We can always bring it up in discussion, ready for the replay, or if you want to watch it later, or just others who are joining us tonight as well. Moving into some of our questions in the chat. Great to see some of you joining us tonight. We'll go through our first one here. I'll bring it up on the screen. How fast does VO2 max change? This, I would love to say this is a very easy question to answer, but it's not. The simplest way I can look at it is, I mean, on average, across, and it actually reminds me of it. I've got written on my whiteboard here, a topic I'm going to cover in a video very, very soon, is what have I learned after seeing the better part of 1,300, 1,500 VO2 max tests. I've kind of lost count of how many I've done, performed for athletes now in terms of running their tests. But on average, VO2 max will change in about a 10 to 12 week window, given the appropriate stimulus. So that's an athlete coming in to see me. They do the testing. We understand exactly what they need to do to be able to change that VO2 max, what intensity they need to do, what type of training, whether it be high intensity, maybe some long slow mixed in there as well. Maybe it's a bit more threshold based, whatever it is, short interval, long interval, etc. Then we come back sort of 10, 12 weeks later, we can usually see some sort of adaptation. For some, it's a little bit closer to a 14-week period. For some, we might see something after 8 weeks. And really, all this comes down to is what we call the law of diminishing returns. So based on a handful of factors, age, genetics, gender as well, male versus female, what type of sport you're doing, what type of training you're doing, how often you're training, how long have you been training for, so what we call your training age. You might be 30 years of age as a human, but you've only been doing cycling for 3 years, so your training age is 3 years, for example, and what level have you been competing at. All of these factors come into how quickly your VO2 max might change and what period of time we might expect. For someone who's a really elite level, who's at right at the top of their development, they don't have much more to gain, maybe 1%, it might take us years to be able to get that extra tiny little bit, but then at the same point, we may not even be worrying about that change. For someone who's never done any, for example, cycling's an easy one. If I take a runner, they've got lots of injury history, chronic injuries running, they decide to pick up cycling. I see this all the time. Initially, they're pretty ordinary because they haven't really ridden bikes. After 3 months, they're 10, 15% better in terms of what their VO2 max is. After 6 months, they're compared to their initial, they're like 20, 25% better than what they were because they've gone from not doing anything at all and starting from scratch to doing something. That's always the biggest part. And that's this law of diminishing returns, I guess, theory, is that as you start, the learning curve is the steepest component, or our adaptation rate is as fast as it's going to be early on in your training. So when we're starting for relatively low base, when we don't have much physiological condition in us or the aerobic conditioning in us, it's really easy to get good really fast, and you can basically do kind of anything when you're first starting out. Then it gets harder and harder. Why? Because we start getting closer and closer and closer to our what we call a genetic potential. So as it starts to get closer to that point, we start to see the graph round off a little bit. What does that mean? It's harder to induce an adaptation, so it's usually going to take a little bit longer to induce that adaptation, or we have to do something a little bit more interesting in terms of the type of stimulus. So without giving you the necessary the throwaway response of it's individualized and it's all dependent on the individual person, it is a little bit, but there's all these little factors that I've gone through, but it's the type of thing in the average person that I see who has a little bit to go until they've hit that very top end. We can see VO2 max change relatively quickly, particularly if you haven't necessarily targeted it before correctly. We have some athletes who think they're working hard enough, they do a lot of threshold work, maybe just above threshold, but they don't do anything right up at their VO2 max because they don't know where it is. They come in, they test, they identify where their VO2 max is. Now we do the training up there, and they adapt. Within 8 weeks, they'll be significantly improved. Then it comes down to how much do they improve in that time. Again, very individualized based on that curve I'm talking about in terms of law of diminishing returns. So how fast does VO2 max change? Very fast if you've got a lot to gain. Not very fast if you're already quite the top end of your game. For most people, I would say, amateur and recreational athletes, we can change it pretty quickly. It's the type of thing that it doesn't really take too much to move. Our higher trained top end age groups, etc., are a little bit different, but for most amateur or recreational athletes, very, very quickly. Great question though in terms of VO2 max change, because there is some, I guess, interesting, when I say interesting, a bit sort of silly debate around is VO2 max adaptable and can we actually change it? Well, yes, we can. We know we can. It's a very easy process to be able to adapt VO2 max. Then talking about how fast it changes is an interesting factor as well. But like I said, it is a little bit more individualized based on all of those variables. So great to see it answer the question. Really appreciate you sending that one through. If you've got another question, feel free to chuck in the chat. I know we're starting to grow a little bit here. So 7 or 8 jumping in the stream at the moment. Already got a few questions in tonight, which is great. And I'll get to Josh, your question now. Slightly different one here, as you mentioned, but do you think that a daily meditation plan could potentially help lower heart rate during running? Interesting point. And where I find this a really sort of good question is that I guess the point of you doing maybe the meditation side of things would likely be bit of de-stress, bit of relaxation, try and get you into a bit more of a calm state. What would that maybe do? Being in a bit more calm, in a calm sort of state, might loosen up a few things in terms of how your diaphragm's functioning. If you're really focusing on your breathing, getting that deep belly breath in, so you're getting a good amount of airflow into the lungs, a bit more relaxed through the intercostal muscles, so the ones in between your ribs, basically opens everything up a bit. You might just sort of improve your posture a little bit, open up through the chest. just that mental relaxation can sometimes be enough to settle you down. What might that do when you get into your run? As long as you can carry that relaxed sensation, I would think that, yeah, potentially your heart rate could be a little bit lower, because that more relaxed state is going to induce a much better, I guess, process of getting air and oxygen into the system and then being able to transport and utilize it. It's not necessarily going to change what your heart rate will do in response to a particular stimulus, because your heart rate is going, like if intensity goes up, your heart rate's inevitably going up. Will it be potentially lower than comparative if you didn't do that? Maybe. Largely it's going to come from just that being a bit more relaxed and not feeling like you're as stressed. A really interesting, I guess, point of it is really around that sort of breathing side of things. And if we can induce a much better belly breath, a more relaxed breath, where we're not breathing through our chest as much, which quite often happens when you're a bit stressed just from daily activity. I mean, like you have your hard day at work, a stressful day at work, you've done a lot of training, you're a bit fatigued. If you're breathing quite heavily through your chest and sort of that, like quite or not panicked breathing, but a little bit more short and sharp, heart rate's probably going to go up because we're just not getting that air supply in. We can breathe a little bit deeper into our diaphragm and just slow things down, stay relaxed. If that's going to happen as a result of doing some daily meditation, then potentially heart rate's going to come down. I mean, the meditation isn't going to do anything to adapt the size of the heart or the stroke volume aspects, which we've talked about in a video that I put up sort of last week, talking about how can we improve our stroke volume, how can we get our heart rate down by changing the size and the strength or the way of how forceful the heart beats. It's not going to do anything there. But what it might do is just from the way the nervous system triggers in terms of keeping you in that more relaxed state, particularly for your longer runs, might just bring it down a little bit. The body's in that, I guess, a better mindset really to be a little bit more comfortable. So I think it's interesting. I think the benefits from a mental health side of things and from a sports psychology side of things of doing some mindfulness or doing some daily meditation are useful anyway. If that has an effect on your physiology in terms of lower heart rate, great. If it doesn't and heart rate stays the same, you're probably still going to feel better and a little bit calmer, a little bit more relaxed, find it easier, get to sleep, all of those things. I think they're probably almost more important side effects of doing some daily meditation is, can we get to sleep and can a lot quicker and have a much better quality sleep? Are we going to be just a bit more relaxed in our daily activity so we're not wasting any energy on, I mean, when you're stressed, I tend to do it. I fidget a little bit sometimes when I'm stressed. You get that little knee bounce and things like that. All of that is going to be burning a little bit of fuel and just keeping you from getting right into that recovery state. We're going to maximize recovery. So something like meditation can be a good aspect for that. Hopefully that answers your question there, Josh. Let me know in the chat if I've sort of covered everything there. If you've got some extra little bits you wanted me to touch on in that space. I think it's a really good thing to do. It's definitely something I do a fair bit, not necessarily daily, but quite regularly. I try and do some sort of, whether it's a mindfulness activity, whether it is a bit of meditation. I quite like the Headspace app before bed. Just chuck that on. I chuck my phone on my pillow and just like listen to it very quietly. Helps me fall asleep really, really quickly, which is a good one. Again, getting into that recovery process. And I've also been working through a couple of things in terms of some breathing exercises and things like that to really open up the diaphragm. But then I'll sort of pass on to what I'm doing with athletes as well. So more to come on that because I'm still working through and sort of just continuing to educate myself on that side of things. And I'll bring you a little bit more once I've sort of got my head around it a little bit further and I start to implement it myself, start to see some change, implement it some athletes, see some change there. I'll start to bring it a little bit broader on and start talking about it a bit more on the YouTube channel here. Great questions so far, guys. Thanks for sending them through. We're going to get to Aaron, your one in a second, one of our members. As always, our members do get priority in the chat. So if you're thinking of joining up as a member, you can hit the join button down below underneath the video here. What it does is allows you to support the channel above and beyond subscribing, sending in your questions, commenting, getting involved on Instagram, whatever it might be. I appreciate all of that, but if you do want to support the channel anymore to help me get some new equipment, sort out some different lighting as we've sort of seen through the last couple of videos this week and then tonight. Got a bit of blue going on behind me, I don't know, just mix it up, make it a little bit more interesting, but then the lighting is a little bit better. I actually spent some time and some effort trying to make sure that this lighting is a little bit cleaner for what we can see on the camera, and I think it's worked so far. I mean, the videos came out really great this week, so looking forward to how they turn out. Let me know as well, what color do you want the background to be? Do you want it to be a particular color? I mean, I personally like the blue. I think it looks quite nice, but I can change it to pretty much whatever I like. So if you have a preference of the color, let me know in the chat as well. We can play around and have a bit of a game, have a bit of fun with that in some of the upcoming videos as well. Before I get into your question though, Awesome to see we got a new member. Jacob, welcome to Team NJ Sports Science. Thank you so much for supporting the channel above and beyond. Really do appreciate it. It does help me continue to grow what we're doing here. So appreciate you jumping on board. As you'll see, you'll get the little NJ badge next to your name now to show off in the chat, but then also in the comment section of any future videos. Again, really appreciate it. Hope you're getting some great value out of the content that we've got up here, and keep the questions and discussion going as well. So really do appreciate it, mate. Thanks for that so much. Moving back into some of the questions for tonight. Aaron's question, how many and what sort of core training sessions would you recommend? I'm bad at doing anything that isn't directly trained by my sport. Really interesting one. And this kind of leverages off what I was talking about with some of the breathing side of things and some of the, I guess, the nervous system work that I'm sort of moving through and done some professional development on recently, and done some, I guess, looking into and some reading. From a core training perspective, I used to, when I say used to, for the last few years or so, I used to have a really sort of, I guess, strong emphasis on, we have to have, in any strength training session or throughout the week, we have to have some sort of core training. It was the traditional stuff, like doing some sort of plank, maybe some sort of dead bug, or like a bird dog variation, whatever you want to call it, Superman's, whatever you want to call it, where you're basically like on your back, arms and legs up, this arm goes back, that leg, the opposite leg goes down, etc. Side planks, the works, maybe some glute bridges. All of those things I think are still good exercises. Then I've always sort of challenged it though in my own head, thinking through, even when we look at cycling, for example, in a time trial position, that's probably the closest to a plank we're going to get, but it's never going to fully replicate a plank, is it? I mean, we're not on the entire time in that position. We're a little bit more curled up, a little bit ideally, or a little bit more relaxed, because we want to stay relaxed to get as much power as we can. And it's more about the transfer of force up and down the chain rather than, and rotationally, depending on the type of athlete you are, rather than it is bracing. I mean, how often do we really need to brace and hold during our sports performance? Running, even standing upright. And I guess it's maybe a hard thing to get your head around, but even when we're standing upright and we're running, yes, we want to have a strong core to be able to keep us upright, but it's more about how can we leverage through the core and transfer forces from the hip up to the arm to give us a good arm swing, to then use that momentum to travel back down into the hip to be able to allow us to propel. It's these components of the core that are more interesting for us, that are producing, allowing us to transfer those forces to produce some quality movement and powerful movement. Rather than if you try to run and really go, all right, if you think about sucking your belly button into where your spine is, really sort of, I guess, brace everything and then try and run, you'd almost find it very difficult to do. Very rarely do we actually really sort of tense. You also probably find it hard to breathe as well, because everything's kind of restricted. So I've started to move personally away from doing things like planks and things like that. I think dead bugs are a good one, because I look at that more of as a coordination across the body, in diagonals as well. The right hip, it tends to, particularly running wise, when we're looking at opposites, the right hip and the right hip and the left shoulder, right shoulder and left hip, everything's working in sort of zigzags like that. I like that sort of adding in those movements. I think a lot of the bracing though is where I've sort of taken out of my programming over the last little while, particularly personally for myself, and I'm going to start doing that for a lot of the athletes I work with and do strength programming for, is take out some of the bracing work. Maybe every now and then it's good to do to challenge, but in terms of your point on directly trained by your sport, it's not exactly, when I say functional, I don't like using the word functional for strength exercises because it's kind of a bit of a silly term, but it's not really doing us much good. It's kind of like sit-ups as well. I mean, doing sit-ups, I've never been a great big programmer of sit-ups for an endurance athlete, because that's all what we call rectus abdominis, which is the muscle on the outside. Sure, it might help from a six-pack perspective, but is that going to make us a better athlete? If you're a combat sport athlete, you're getting punched in the guts a lot, yeah, it's going to give you some body armor. If you're an endurance athlete, you're not getting hit. So it's all about running and being as effective, as efficient as possible, which is the main thing. So from that perspective, I wouldn't, when I say I don't necessarily worry about specific core anymore, I might do some things around dead bugs. I think core as well is not just the abdominals, it is your hips too. So making sure you're doing something to strengthen up the glutes, whether it be hip thrust, glute bridges, single leg glute bridges, strengthen up through the hamstring as well with some, you could do like a glute bridge slider, You could do isometric hamstring holds, making sure the quads, but then also your hip flexors are strong as well. Your soles are strong. All of these types of things, but a lot of that will then also come from good neuromuscular development too. So you don't necessarily have to do anything too crazy. You just got to have the nervous system working in a really functional, effective way. And a lot of that does start with, as we kind of mentioned before, it does start with the breath a lot of the time, making sure your body is nice and relaxed, and so it's and getting a good amount of air in. We're getting that all happening. We're loose. We're ready to go. Our nervous system is switched on. That is going to allow us to coordinate those movements a lot better and generate a lot more force, etc. So we're then not compensating. I think where we start to get a bit lost is doing things like planks and that. Cool, it might be challenging to be able to learn to plank for 5 minutes, but one, how specific is that to your sport? Not really. Like swimmers, cyclists, runners, it's not specific at all because we've got moving parts all the time. You're never just lying there stiff. But then outside of that, it's the type of thing that, I mean, if we're doing that and without like, does that cause, as much as nothing ever switches off completely, but does that cause a little bit of a change in how we innovate the system? When I say innovate, innervate, not innovate, how the nervous system controls everything. Does that cause a compensation somewhere? Is that why abdominals are really heavily switched on when we're running, and that causes the glutes to not be as active? Does that cause the lower back to start to have some issues because the glutes are not as active, or is not as switched on and not as coordinated? Those types of things. So really, short answer is I start to move away from it. And really, my core work now is when I squat, my core is active and it is doing something that is functional to my movement. When I deadlift, my core is active and doing something functional to my movement. When I do an overhead press, when I do an upper body push, when I do a pull up, all of these more specific movements to my sport, my core is doing its job in those. So by doing extra, am I getting any extra bang for buck? Probably not. So I then look at it from a time effectiveness as well. In the week, what am I getting most bang for buck from? That's really my new answer. Had you asked me this question a few years ago, I would have been completely different. But I think it's something that I've grown to then understand. I think it's something that we will start to progressively see more and more, is move away from my core workout is side planks, dead bugs, and another bracing movement. Yes, being able to brace in certain aspects is good, but it's more about how well can we transfer forces, and that's what the core is there for. It's to connect the lower body to the upper body and back down the other way, rather than be like, if I brace now, like, cool, that gives me a position to maybe push off. But if that's not specific to your sport, then we're kind of doing it for no real end. And I've kind of rambled a little bit, and I may have been a bit vague there, but definitely going to be talking a little bit more on the channel, coming back to my point on the breathing side of things and some nervous system stuff that I've been looking into and working on. I definitely think there's some benefit there, to be able to not necessarily have to focus too much on core, but more work on how can we switch on the nervous system a bit more effectively to get more out of what that core, so to speak, is doing, rather than just do a whole bunch of planks and you'll get better. I think that's a pretty sort of overly simplistic way to look at it, and I don't think necessarily effective. Coming to your second point there, that's just popped up in the chat. Glad to hear that. Is swimming more than enough to train the core? I'm pretty weak up top and have trouble with swimming. I think in terms of, again, being more functional with it, if you're going and doing some swimming, and I mean, mentioning it before you start to get into triathlon, I think we were having that discussion last week. As you get more into swimming, the rotational aspect in terms of linking that upper body, and the better you get at that technique side of swimming, is going to link that upper body to lower body in your hip, leverage off the right hip to get that better catch and the pull on the left arm, opposite sides, etc. Transfer that pull from the left arm down to the right hip so you can move through the water well. That is core. That is fundamentally core in terms of through the torso region. If we're connecting forces up and down the chain, that is what your core is doing. So I think by adding that in, it's definitely going to help you. The weakness up top is just going to come from that muscular endurance of not having done much swimming. The more you swim, it's the same with the bike. Typically, if you've never done any cycling before, my first thing to tell you to get better as a cyclist or a triathlete, if you're getting into the cycling side of things in that respect, is to just spend time in the saddle. That's going to give you the muscular endurance to be able to be a lot better than what you are. Then we can worry about the specifics of it. Same with the swimming. You kind of just have to you got to focus on technique, sure, but you kind of just have to get in and practice swimming to get the muscular endurance under the belt, so your upper body just develops that natural bit of muscle. You'll look at all the best swimmers in the world, they've got really broad shoulders, big shoulders. Why? And generally long levers, because over time their body's adapted in that way to be strong enough to be able to pull through the water. Particularly for males, swimming is predominantly upper body based. Very minimal propulsion from the kick. We get a bit of propulsion, but it's the type of thing you're getting most of your propulsion through how your upper body moves and how it interacts going from shoulder to hip, basically. Anything from hip down is kind of just there to keep you stable more than anything and stop you from rocking. It's just there to keep things ticking along from a kick perspective. So definitely think it's worth it. I mean, if we're looking at maybe some exercise that might be specific is any activity where you are sort of connecting right arm to left hip or left hip to right arm. Anything we're getting that sort of diagonal pattern happening is going to be a bit more specific to swimming. I think that's useful, but movement-wise, rather than, like I said, just bracing in a quite even position. Anything that's generating that movement and transferring forces is our most ideal way to do it. Perfect. We'll move into our next question. Great questions coming through tonight, guys. Really good discussion. It's already been half an hour. We've already hit 8 o'clock, so fantastic to be flying through this, and great to see more and more joining as we go. As I mentioned at the beginning, replay will be up. I'll go through and time code it so you can skip back to the questions you want to cover, or if you've missed some of tonight already, you can skip through the questions and have a look at what you might be interested in. Click through, click back. It'll make it nice and easy for you as well. I think that's probably a better way to do it rather than cutting through a highlights video. Give you all the questions and you guys can pick which ones you think are the best rather than me picking for you, because I'm sure I probably get it wrong a lot of the time and not able to go through and have a look at what's going on. But also, as we had a couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago now, we had some failures with some of the equipment. The camera blew up and laptop sort of carked at the end of the live stream. So it was the type of thing that I didn't actually have a download of the file to go and cut up. I just had the live stream that was already straight uploaded to YouTube. So being able to go through and do the time codes. And I'll go back and do the time codes in previous ones if you want to go have a look at them. I think that's probably the easiest way to then do it in the future as well. Make it nice and easy for you guys to find the questions that you're after, particularly if someone's already asked it before. But if someone's asked it before and we cover it again on a live stream because you're new to the channel or you're watching for the first time, you're joining us on a live for the first time, just ask it anyway. No question's a bad question. If we answer it 10 times in 10 weeks, perfectly fine, because if it's for 10 different people, great. That's going to help more people, because some people don't see every live stream, some people don't see every replay. So the more times we cover some of those topics, the better. Coming into our next question, how to improve running economy and efficiency efficiently. I nearly stumbled over my words trying to say that. You caught me there in terms of what's going on. In terms of running economy, a couple of ways we can look at it from an improvement side of things. Running economy fundamentally is, it comes down to how the oxygen cost for that output. So when we look at a particular speed, let's say 4-minute Ks, because it's a nice flat number in most people's brains. If we look at 4-minute kilometers, 4 minutes per K, 15 kilometers an hour. An improvement in running economy, what it would look like to start with is I can run at 4-minute K pace, and instead of having a oxygen consumption or VO2 of 55 mils per kilo per minute, my VO2 is now 53 mils per minute or 50 mils per kilo per minute. I'm putting out the same amount of work or output, same amount of speed, pace, whatever you want to call it, but I'm not using as much oxygen to do it. Why? And we got to be careful. We got to be careful that it's not we're just using a bit more anaerobic contribution. We're just more effective at using the oxygen. And what that means is we've got a better breakdown of fuel happening. We're able to process that fuel a little bit more effectively. This is where some efficiency comes into it. So from a physiology perspective, is there a change in our composition of, if we get fitter and faster, if that happens, is there a change of our percentage of carb versus fat at that particular intensity? If we're using a little bit more fats, maybe we see a bit of oxygen consumption come up a little bit initially, but as we get more efficient in that process, maybe it sort of regulates and sort of stays the same, maybe even drops. From that's from a physiology perspective in terms of fuel utilization and things like that. Typically though, as you start to use more fats, you'll tend to use more oxygen for that same output, because fats are harder to break down than carbohydrates. It takes a little bit more time as a result, because they're a little bit more complex. So usually we actually see it go the other way, but metabolic efficiency you can look at a little bit. Majorly the ones that we normally think of for running economy improvement is strength training is a good one, plyometric training, anything that is going to improve our ability to produce force and produce force repeatedly over time. So that's where if we can increase the size, a little bit of the size of the muscle, the strength of the tendon, the reactive, or if we want to call it reactive component of the tendon. So when you land, you can spring back off nice and quickly, which comes from things like plyometric type exercises, comes from doing that type of work and more the power end of the spectrum rather than the strength or the hypertrophy end of the spectrum when it comes to the gym. That's, I guess, the classic one in terms of improving running economy. I mean, there's a number of studies that show strength training can have a positive effect on running economy. Another side of it is then fundamentally technique. I mean, the number of runners who have a pretty average technique, even at the elite level, there's a lot of elite runners who are running very fast marathon times, for example, who have pretty ordinary textbook techniques, but they're quite economical because of the way their tendons interact, because of the way that they can produce that output over a long period of time. The oxygen cost is actually quite low for that output, therefore not having to work as hard because everything's working quite effectively. So really, they're really the key factors if we're looking at how to improve running economy. There's actually if we're looking at a really big spectrum, if I quickly try and find, just while we're talking through it, I've got a table of it. I know exactly where it is compared to last week where I had to scroll through and find it. I'm actually going to bring up the chart in terms of determinants of things like running economy. It is quite complex. I've just listed a couple of components there. I think some of the key components there, but the complexity of it, I think, is something we should really touch on here in terms of what are all the factors that do contribute to a person's running economy. Running economy and efficiency, we have to be careful about the terminology. Economy is the oxygen cost. Efficiency is more to do with the metabolic side of things and fuel utilization, etc. So to produce that output. So they are two different things. They aren't the same. So need to be careful when we are talking about those terms. You can't use them interchangeably. To strict to their definition, you can't use them interchangeably. They do get used interchangeably, which is kind of incorrect. And the main thing is efficiency for the most part is reasonably set. So at 70% of VO2 max, you're probably going to be using a large amount of fats, pretty low percentage of carbohydrates. At threshold, you're going to be using a large amount of carbohydrates, pretty low percentage of fats. That's going to stay the same. What will change though is your ability to produce an output in terms of speed. So using the same percentage or same efficiency, but you have a better economy. That's the type of thing we're starting to get into. So hopefully I didn't confuse anyone with some of those terms there. I've got it up here. So give me a second to quickly scroll through and find the graph, just being a little bit slow. What I might do is shut this one. Hopefully it's going to help speed it up now that I've closed that window. I've got a few things open running in the background. Get through. Where is that little table? May as well screen share and show you where I'm scrolling through at the moment. These are some of my uni notes, so bear with me while I just scroll through to the running section from a unit I did earlier in the year where we talked exactly about this. But I really think it's useful talking about the whole set of components or whole set of factors that go into that was the graph we showed last week in terms of importance of VO2 max, running economy, lactate threshold. It's not too far off. I know it's in this next little section. It's quite a big graph. So yeah, here we go. So this is running economy. I think this is actually a really good way to then start to talk about it. So this is running economy here. All of these factors will contribute to how you can improve your running economy. And again, running economy being oxygen cost for a particular output. Ideally, better economy is reducing that oxygen cost. So we have things like metabolic efficiency, like I said before, substrate utilization, carb versus fat percentage, what your muscle fiber type is like. Genetics play a role in a number of all of these components, and will determine a lot of these components. But genetically, what is our fiber type like? What's our core temperature like, usually based on our fuel utilization, etc., and our environment, which has a pretty sort of crossover effect in terms of particularly substrate utilization, and then also temperature produced as a result of burning fuel, has a pretty strong link with our cardiorespiratory efficiency, which is things like our VO2 max, what our heart rate is like, and what our ventilation is like. All those factors that we know in terms of the oxygen consumption pathway or the oxygen uptake pathways, to be able to get oxygen into the system, get it to where it needs to go, break down fuel substrates, to be able to then create energy. Those are relatively interlinked, quite strongly linked. Then we've got this whole component of training. What is our training history? How long have you been running for? What is your training type? Are you doing lots of high intensity training, or are you doing mainly long and slow? Is lots of long and slow causing you to sink your hips a bit? That's going to influence. Maybe the high intensity forces you into that more upright posture. That's just one example. Not always the case, but definitely can be one of the examples when you add in a bit of high intensity. What part of the training phase are we in? Are we in a phase where we want to be peaked and have our economy ticking all the boxes, or are we trying to specifically more work on a physiological adaptation? Are we trying to improve VO2 max or what our heart rate is doing? Quality versus quantity in terms of training, our fatigue status, the training surface as well. You're going to get much better economy on an athletics track than you are on some loose gravel or maybe even grass, wet grass in particular, thick grass. Why? Because a softer surface isn't going to give you as much back in terms of we put force into the ground, the ground gives us force back. A firmer or a slightly springy surface like an athletics track, you hit it and you sort of bounce off it. Really good transfer force returning back into you, or what we call ground reaction force. Soft grass, it compresses, it reduces how much force actually hits the ground, so it takes you longer to get there, so it's going to spring you back longer, and it's going to drain you a little bit more. That's why you find you have dead legs when you run on grass. If you do, or you're running on hard surfaces, you're on the grass, you feel like it's harder to produce that same speed or same output, and you sometimes feel you have dead legs because you're not getting as much rebound back. Biomechanical efficiency, this is more where we're starting to get into how well do you move, technique alike. Your anthropometrics, which is just your limb size, your leg length. You have a look at some of the African runners in particular have quite, and even some of the research studies have shown they've got quite long Achilles tendons, like significantly longer than the rest of the people in the world. So they have this incredible ability to be able to produce this awesome spring in their legs so they can go. That's all to do with their genetics, but then also what is their growth and development like? Their running style, as I mentioned before, technique plays a big role. I've talked about previously on the channel, making sure your technique is a nice sort of smooth, everything is connected, everything is moving in the right way, and we're looking at the right components. We're not just trying to lift the knee up because we want a higher knee drive to bring it through. It's, well, is that pattern happening because we're not thinking about getting our knee up, or is that happening because our arms are doing something funny that's causing a compensation? Perfect sort of link that we can make there. Our kinematics and kinetics are basically to do with the forces and what's going on throughout the body. Kinematics is more the description of the movements, so similar to our running style, like looking at a running technique and describing the movement. Kinetics is all to do with the forces, measuring on a force plate, for example, where are our forces going, what direction, what we call the vectors. So are we producing force down and back, or are we producing force more vertically, so straight up and down? Straight up and down isn't as effective as down and back. Down and back is going to help us propel forward, not necessarily just up, for example. Flexibility as well is going to play a role, similar to anthropometrics. And then the last one here, neuromuscular efficiency. Neural signaling. How well can we recruit motor units? How well can we recruit muscular fibers? The more fibers we can recruit, the more forceful the contraction. Which then comes down to force production. Stiffness through the Achilles. Do we have that nice strong spring, or are things sort of sagging at the bottom, or that impact phase and then slowly coming back? Good stiffness is going to give us a good nice springy rebound. Motor programming as well, which then comes down to things like running technique. So that is running economy in a nutshell. Really, there we have a lot of things going on. As I mentioned, there some of the key components in there are things that we know and think about, but there's also a lot of this training history stuff has a big deal to do with it. The type of training you're doing. The nervous system, I like, as I've mentioned probably a couple of times already tonight, is something I'm really interested in and wanting to bring more so to the channel in terms of ways that we can sort of tap into that nervous system a little bit better. But it's the type of thing, if we can get that nervous system working better, it's all of this stuff isn't necessarily sending the correct signals from our brain, neural signaling, to be able to cause that improvement in force production. So there's running economy in a nutshell. Metabolic efficiency is a little bit over on this side, but it's all of these factors combined give us an improved economy to bring down our oxygen cost for the same output. And having a look at what that does for performance, I guess a good follow-up, just lucky that this was underneath the graph from before, but why is running economy important? Both runners have the same VO2 max. This is runner A, this is runner B. So the square circles, you can see they have the same VO2 max, but why can this runner go longer, they have a better running economy. Results in a higher velocity at VO2, which means more sustainable submaximal. You see, if they both ran at 20.5 kilometers an hour, runner B, this one on the bottom here, would be at a submaximal intensity. Runner A would be at their VO2 max intensity. So that might be a 5 to 7 minute effort for runner A. Runner B, it could be a 15-minute effort. Obviously, that's going to have a pretty significant change in performance in terms of overall in that type of event. So clearly, this one is more superior, and that's what we want to see. We even see this between the same person as they become more highly trained. Is the same VO2. We don't get any extra oxygen usage, but we actually get them at a faster speed. I'm also ticking that box and saying that's a significant improvement. I want to see that. If you can produce the same oxygen consumption for a higher output, bonus. It's like when we get more aero on the bike. Think about it that way. You produce more power through the bike, cool. But if we're not as aero, we're not going to have as much speed. But if we produce the same amount of power, but we get more aerodynamic and we go faster, well, that's a more sustainable intensity, isn't it? Or that's a more sustainable way of creating that work. So I hope that gives you a bit of an insight there. Bit of a long one, but I think it's a really interesting discussion to have. And so great question coming through. And just the follow-up to that, as I've just seen in the chat there, really interesting. Yeah, 100% agree. But do you use the running data from Garmin to analyze efficiency? Coming back to what we were saying before, economy. I'm just thinking through too many things in my head at once, and I sort of went blank there. To analyze economy, like vertical oscillation, right-left balance, ground contact time. I don't. That's something that I've mentioned before, I think, in a maybe a live stream, etc. But it's something that I don't use any of those metrics in terms of the heart rate stuff, mainly because for me and my own training and looking at it, it's a bit of information overload. And am I getting much use out of it? Probably not. And majority of athletes that I work with, they're doing the qualitative stuff. And when I say qualitative, looking at their movement, more the kinematic stuff, looking at the movement, making some positive change to their movement, it's going to do a lot more than looking at the numbers and then seeing if that's any different. Because everyone's going to have slightly different vertical oscillation and right-left balance, etc. We obviously want those to be ticking some boxes, but I don't necessarily look at any of those Garmin metrics from a running economy side of things. Mainly as well because I've got lab testing equipment that I can go and put someone on a treadmill, measure their oxygen consumption, measure what speed they're at, and then see an improvement a couple of months down the track and see, okay, we're same oxygen consumption but running a faster speed, improvement in running economy, tick the box. Then I can then easily identify, okay, do we have to do something from a technique perspective or any of those other components as we just mentioned before. So I don't use those, to be completely honest. You can use them. I'm not saying you can't, but I think it's the type of thing I'm really interested from a data analysis perspective of getting the most bang for buck out of the information that I'm collecting. If I'm collecting it for the sake of collecting it, it's not going to do anything for me because I'm not going to look at it. I'm not going to make a meaningful insight. If I'm collecting it and it's able to change the way I might program something or change the way I think or impact my decision making positively, then I'm more interested in it. And that's where things like for running, for example, I'd be more interested at looking at a power meter and how that technology is progressing, because that might be a much better way of identifying for our trail runners, our long distance ultra runners, people who live in hilly areas. That's a better way of quantifying their intensity when they're undulating on terrain, so we get the same stimulus as what they would be getting on the flat. I'm more interested in something like that and adding that part of data to what I do in terms of prescription. But good question though, because I know a lot of people do use it. You can if you like. I just haven't personally used it a lot, so it's not something that I think is necessarily important for what I'm doing. But if you want to have a look at it, go for it. Go right ahead. All right. Coming into our next question here, have been on for quite a while now. We're starting to get up to the 50-minute mark, which is great. Might sort of cap it about sort of the hour because I know we did start a little bit late, and I do have a few little admin tasks to get through from the end of the working day. Got another great question come through. Thanks for sending a second one in tonight. But what do you think of hypoxic training? I'm assuming is what you're meaning. Hypoxic, hyperoxic. So the interesting thing with these terms, and it's funny when they come through because it can be quite difficult to get your head around because they do sound all the same. Same with acclimatization and acclimation. They're basically written almost identically, but they sound very different. Instead of saying hyperoxic, it would be hyperbaric is the term that we would normally know, which anytime we see hyper means there's more of. So hyperthermia, Hyper thermia, would be we're too hot. Hypothermia, Hypo, would be we're too cold. Like we're too cold. We're getting low body temperatures. So hyperoxic, if you like, is excessive amounts of oxygen. Hypoxic or hypooxic, if you want to call it that, is not enough oxygen. So that was like going to altitude. Let me know in the chat which one you're actually referring to there, just so we can make sure we're covering the right thing. But I'll just cover both anyway while I'm waiting. In terms of hyper, the additional oxygen side of things, not a massive amount of benefit. Really, the only time that gets used to effect is in medical circumstances. In terms of like people recovering from what they call the bends, so deep sea divers who don't depressurize when they come back up from really high amounts of pressure on their body as they're coming back up to the surface, can get this it really plays with their balance and things like that, and it can be quite damaging for them, and internally as well. Their body doesn't readjust to the pressure of coming back up to sea level compared to deep down below. They put them in hyperbaric chambers to be able to get as much oxygen in there as they can, which is going to help relieving that process. Try to minimize the effect of nitrogen and things like that from being at those sort of pressures. Hypoxic, as I sort of mentioned, is kind of like going to altitude. It's removing some of the oxygen out of there. I think in terms of the hyper stuff, the additional oxygen, as I said, more medical type of things are where it's at. For the average person jumping in and pumping up some additional oxygen, is that going to do a lot for you in terms of recovery compared to just getting really good quality sleep, good nutrition and hydration? Not really. Supplemental oxygen. So you'll see it quite a bit. The NFL is a good example, actually, and some of the American sports, but the NFL in particular. I was watching the other day, some of the offensive linemen and the defensive linemen, the really big dudes who are at the front blocking, they have oxygen masks next to them on the bench, and they'll be pumping themselves in because they're doing such excessive amounts of, like, they're doing such high intensity for what their body can handle. They also fatigue really, really quickly because it's just a really explosive bout. So anytime they have to do big runs, they'll jump down and they'll be straight on the oxygen to try and help them just get their breath back. That's not necessarily going to do too much in terms of recovery other than just help them get their breath back, because their aerobic endurance and that type of thing is just awful, because they just don't need to do it. That's positionally, they don't need to be able to run lots. They just need to go from crouched on the ground to standing up, basically. It's almost like a sumo wrestler type sort of thing for an offensive lineman. So it's the type of thing that for endurance athletes, though, when we're talking about that, I don't think the extra oxygen is necessarily going to do anything. It's more in medical application, which I guess that NFL football example is probably more, I guess, a medical application for them, where it's just to be able to get them back to a resting state and a normal state without them basically passing out from a lack of oxygen, because they're so ineffective at that process, because they're so good at the explosive type stuff. It's the type of thing that they jump on that and it helps them. Outside of that, I wouldn't necessarily worry about it too much. It's an additional expense for not much benefit. If you psychologically think it's going to help you, maybe the belief effect and placebo kicks in a bit, sure. But at that point, it's just like, it's not doing a massive amount. I don't think it's necessarily something that's going to revolutionize what you do or dramatically change anything for the better. It's just going to be another sort of minimal 0.5% to 1% at best, of which case is it worth it? Probably not for most people. Hopefully that answers that one there, and hopefully it was an interesting question, though, because it has popped up a few times in the industry talking about the hyperbaric side of things and extra oxygen. Hypoxic's more the traditional one that we do talk about in terms of reducing the amount of oxygen to stimulate EPO, things like that. The hyperbaric isn't necessarily going to do much of that. It's just supplying with a bit more oxygen. So in theory, you should be able to recover a little bit better, but it more works in medical application rather than training application or performance application. Jacob, one of our newest members, jumping in with a question all about ultra running. When training for a 100k ultra, how important is it to train high intensity work? How will you structure a training week for 100k? Really interesting one, because the traditional thing with ultra runners, or the traditional thing with really long endurance events, is let's go specific, so let's just run long and slow all the time. When I structure high intensity training in, it's not too different to how I would do it for a 100k athlete. I'm talking. It's not too different to how I would do it for a marathon runner or a 10k runner. The difference in the program, though, is the distribution of how much high intensity versus how much long and slow. For a 100k ultra, majority of your work is going to be long and slow, and that that makes most sense. I mean, most of our volume is going to be long and slow, and you're doing more Ks in the week than what a marathon runner would, and they're doing more Ks than what a half marathon, more Ks than what a 10K, and it flows down the chain. That 10K runner or the 5K runner is probably doing a greater distribution of high intensity though, compared to the rest of their volume. So because their volume is less, doing a couple of high intensity sessions a week, 2 to 3, is a significantly greater chunk of their week versus a 100K ultra runner who's doing like maybe a 4-hour run on the weekend, or maybe a 4-hour run on a Saturday, 2-hour run on a Sunday, whatever it might be, as part of their training. The distribution in the week isn't as much out of your total training load. It starts to drop a little bit lower. So I wouldn't necessarily do anything too different. And why I say that is because we still need the ability to be able to get faster. At the end of the day, endurance comes down to 2 fundamental components. If it's an event that has a start and a finish line, it comes down to, can I get from start to finish, which is your long, slow training, and then can I get from start to finish in the fastest possible time? In which case, if you need to get from start to finish in the fastest possible time, we need to improve our top end so our sub-maximal comes up. Even looking at, like I've still got it up here, I'll bring you back to that running economy graph. Even looking at this graph here, it's the type of thing that we've done, like this athlete here who's got the better running economy could potentially be a 100K ultra runner. What we've done is we've improved not necessarily how much oxygen they're using, we've improved their economy so they can run at a faster speed, likely as a result of doing some high intensity training, likely as a result of doing some strength training. Typically from that end, how can they run at 22 Ks an hour? At some point in time, they have practiced running this fast. They haven't done all their work down here because they do all their work down here. It's like anything. You practice it, you get better at it. I did a video on it quite a while ago talking about this. You want to run faster, you need to practice running fast. Move the top end. What does that do sub-maximally? Well, these are your intensities that are going to be working out more sub-maximal. Now we're cruising along in these ones. What are these? Well, they're lower oxygen cost, so more economical, so they're more sustainable. So I can hold this one for significantly longer than what I could before. Again, if we're talking, this is athlete pre-training, this is post-training, so they've adapted and changed. Holding 18 kilometers an hour, for example, I know that's excessively fast for 100K ultra, but bear with me. Where they could hold it here for, let's say they could hold 18 Ks an hour for an hour and a half. Now they can hold it for like hour 45, 2 hours, because it's much more economical. That would be coming as a byproduct of the high intensity. So I still would definitely have it. Yes, I think it's important. As I mentioned, I wouldn't necessarily change too much on how I'd program it. As we get closer to the race, we start to do more longer efforts with shorter recovery, getting from, instead of a VO2 max focus, getting closer and closer to maybe a threshold focus. Adding a bit of high intensity isn't going to hurt. How I then structure it, probably 2 sessions in the week. For most people, it's going to be more than enough. Maybe like a Tuesday, Thursday in the week, Tuesday, Friday. Everything else around that would be your long and slow, building the Ks into legs to get you up for 100K. That is the priority, the long and slow development. The high intensity is there to supplement that, as opposed to if I have a 5K, 10K, half marathon runner, even marathon runner, the high intensity is there and the long and slow is to supplement the intensity. We're just flipping it on its head as the distance goes up. And that applies for other events of that nature, not just ultra running, Ironman triathlon, any of those, like long distance cycling. I still do some high intensity because that's what's going to change the top end of the engine to give you a greater amount to work with. A V8 engine is always more powerful than a V6. Why? Because you can only fit 6 cylinders into a V6 engine. And that's if you neglect the very top end and neglect your ability to perform high intensity work, you're limiting how big your engine is, essentially, in terms of how many cylinders can I fit into it. Sure, it can run all day, but it's the type of thing, if we lift it up, that means all the sub-maximal intensities relative all come up with it. Top end moves maximal, sub-maximal comes with it. So that means, all right, instead of going out and sitting on, I'm going to pull a number here, 5-minute K pace in 100K, you can now sit on 4:45 because the top end moved and it got dragged up. That pace you can hold in that 100K has been dragged up. That's really what we're talking about. So yeah, a couple of times a week, majorly the emphasis is on the long slow, but keep the high intensity in there. And I wouldn't do too much different to how I would do any type of training for like maybe a marathon or shorter in terms of what those high intensity sessions actually have in them. Short and sharp is really good. It's there to supplement it and boost everything up. But yeah, great question, because it is the type of thing for those events you would think, oh, I just need to go out and just practice running long and slow. To an extent, yes. But at the end of the day, if you just go out and practice running at 5-minute Ks, that's not going to help you get better at 4:45 pace. It's going to help you run 5-minute Ks for a lot longer, and it might then have a little bit of an effect on how long you can run 4:45s for, but it's not going to change dramatically. Whereas if you get better at 3:30 pace, and so then 3:45 is a hell of a lot easier, etc. Well, it's like, well, 4:45 is very comfortable now. You know what I mean? So it's just a different shift of what we're looking at overall. The whole notion of run slow to go fast only works if we're trying to increase the amount of time we're running at that same speed for, not increasing the speed that we're trying to run at for the same time. Slight distinction there. Hopefully that made a bit of sense as to where I was going with that. But yeah, great question. And again, thanks for joining up as a part of the team NJ Sports Science as a member, and really continue to help grow and support this channel. I might jump in on this one as our last one here, talking about fitness calculators, because I know we're getting close, or we've just ticked over the hour actually. Really appreciate everyone jumping in tonight. I don't want to take up a massive amount of time, and we did start a little bit later, so I do have to get going in a moment. But last question for tonight before we do finish up. Are fitness calculators based on heart rate on your training accurate and useful? For example, Strava's Fitness and Freshness or Elevate. I'm also maybe going to throw in there the Garmin recovery time type unit. Things like in Training Peaks, you also get, similar to like the Strava Fitness, I would assume, you also get things like your, form, how well you've sort of recovered. I think, and things like Freshness and all of that. I think they're interesting metrics to look at. As with anything, use them in conjunction with some of the subjective information. So we're always going to get a bit of variation in what our heart rate's doing. And at the end of the day, anything that is a calculation or an estimation based on a formula that is made to suit everyone isn't necessarily going to be the best and the only way that you should be going and looking at some of these like recovery-based metrics or freshness metrics, form metrics, etc. Why? Because it's not an equation formulated for you. It's a protocol formulated for the average endurance athlete. So you might get some skews in the results based on the fact of how your heart rate and your data interacts with that formula. Using those numbers though as a trend over time can be quite useful. So am I trying to get a little bit fresher, and is that going in the right direction? Yes or no? Okay, we're starting to see some interesting stuff there. But then also considering the subjective information, like, do you actually feel a lot fresher than you did a week ago or 2 weeks ago? Do you feel fitter than you did 2 weeks ago? Are you just feeling like there's improvement in the session? Are you running faster in that same high intensity session? Are you running faster in your long, slow runs, but your heart rate's staying the same? Or is your heart rate coming down for the same speed? All of those just subjective, like, what do you sort of feel? Factor that into your I guess the way you process that information, you're going to get a much better insight. I always ask my athletes, looking at form, I can look at it on Training Peaks and go, all right, their fatigue levels are really down because we've tapered in for an event. Their form should be up. Sure enough, the graph shows that their form should be quite high. Great, they should be ready to go. But then if I ask that athlete, well, how do you feel? And they tell me they feel awful, I'm probably going to go more off that and allow them to have a little bit of extra recovery, or we do something to try and get them feeling a little bit better, because that's going to play into it a lot more than what the numbers say. The numbers don't necessarily always interact with how you're feeling at the time. It might be predicting a little bit early, it might be predicting a little bit late, is the other thing as well. It might say that you're not feeling fresh at all, but you actually do feel fresh. It's like, well, you've actually just recovered a bit quicker and the numbers are just trying to play catch up with you, and it's a little bit behind, a bit reactive. Or it could be a little bit ahead and over-predicting. It's like, well, it's actually saying you're really fresh, but you feel flat. 2 days later, you feel awesome, but it's starting to come back a bit normal. It's like, well, okay, that's probably a better indicator. We just need to make sure we adjust. So using subjective and objective information, I guess, is in conjunction is the best way to sort of go about it. Having a look at sort of, I guess, a follow-up, I've seen my fitness score going steadily down on both calculators, but I feel fitter. And like I said, it's because they're generic formulas for the majority of people. That's where you're going to run into trouble of it may not always reflect. VO2 max is the big one. My Garmin has said I'm at a VO2 max of about 58 for the better part of 18 months. I don't think I've seen it change. Am I getting fitter? Absolutely, in phases. And am I getting not as fit in phases? Yeah, but my VO2 max has been the same for 18 months, which shouldn't really make much sense. Particularly when I've taken periods off training and had some rest and recovery, or changed my training completely, all of that. I've gone through the last block of my training. I feel definitely probably the fittest I've felt in a little while. VO2 max still says it's the same because of how my heart rate and how my information interacts with the formula and the equation and the way that it plots it out. I wouldn't. If you're only looking at those calculations, you're kind of missing half the information. I would look at it, use it as an indicator, look at it as a trend over time, but then also consider the subjective information. How do you feel and what do you think is going on? But then also just look at your sessions. If you can see objectively in your sessions, you're like, well, I did this session 3 months ago and I did it again today and I'm significantly better. I'm significantly outperforming that same session from 3 months ago in similar conditions, etc. Well, clearly you are fitter. And if those numbers aren't telling you that, well, clearly it's an incorrect formula. Clearly it's not very accurate and not very useful. But if it's showing, okay, it is slowly coming up, maybe not to the extent that I thought it would because I am significantly better in terms of that looking at the data in each of those sessions and being, yeah, I'm clearly better, but it says I've only gone up and improved a little bit. Well, subjectively, you can match it and go, okay, well, it's actually moving quite small in magnitude, but I know it's actually more meaningful. And I can just like zoom in on it a bit and sort of make it seem a bit bigger than it is, or understand that the metric only moves very progressively, not big changes that I might have been expecting. That could just be an expectations thing. So yeah, that's sort of a brief sort of summary on what I do with those. Always sort of take them with a grain of salt and work in some of the subjective stuff, but they can be good ones to then have a look and give you a bit of another perspective on how to look at improving fitness or your freshness, your recovery, and things like that. Always best to look at them over time though, rather than acutely or session by session or week by week. Look at them over a month period or 2 month, 3 month period. It's a better way to do it. All right, I'm going to leave it there, guys. Thanks for all of your questions tonight. Really appreciate you jumping in and joining the discussion. Thanks again to everyone who's jumped in, subscribed, joined up to the channel. Really appreciate the support. Continue to share the videos, like, comment, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. Jump over to Instagram as well. Send me your questions through, like Alan did earlier tonight. Got his question through early because he wasn't going to be able to join us as we go. Always going to cover it on the live stream. Send back a written response as well where I can also. So keep an eye out for that. Head over to Instagram. Send a message. It's the easiest way to get in contact with me. Other than that, great live stream tonight. Appreciate all of you for joining in. Hopefully you got something out of it. Looking forward to seeing you in a video soon. Over the next coming days, we've got one coming tomorrow and then Friday, but then also be ready to join us next week, 7 p.m. Hopefully we can revert back to our normal time next week, or if you like the 7:30 time slot, happy to change and adjust, happy to be flexible with what people prefer. Had good numbers in the live stream tonight, sort of got up close to that 10 mark for a while, which is really, really good to see as well. Again, appreciate your jumping in. Awesome questions tonight. Great discussion. Hopefully you got something out of it. Appreciate all of your time. That is it for tonight, and yeah, we'll see you in the next one.